notes first, then I want to talk about the project a little bit, and then if you are still working on your communication project, you can do that. So I will make sure that I don't overtalk, so that you have time to look through your project if you're not done with that and finish that up. So let's start off with, so immunity is one of those units or concepts or whatever that the irony is that AP Board, College Board made it an illustrative example. We talked about illustrative examples before. Remember what those are? It's a fancy way of saying good examples of homeostasis. So back in the day, we were talking about homeostasis. We had a project on that. And now we need to talk about some illustrative examples, and the immune system would be an example of that. Very complicated, not as much for you, but a very complicated process that tries to keep our body from getting infections, and long story short. And I just think it's ironic how they took out immunity as you need to teach this topic. I think they did it right before COVID. And it just seems that, especially with the issues that we had with vaccines, and how there were a lot of vaccine people who were really opposed to taking a vaccine, that I think that is something that should come back into the curriculum. So I want to make sure that we talk about it so that you can understand from a scientific point of view what's going on with vaccines and infections and all that good kind of stuff. Before we do that, we need to talk a little bit about some terms. And one of those is a pathogen. A pathogen is anything that causes or evokes an immune response from us. And the immune system is dedicated to pathogens, to finding anything that causes disease and hopefully eliminating it, so that we're healthy and we don't get sick. This next picture I just leave in here because I think it's cool. This is the thing that's in white there is what we call a macrophage. So all of this here, this is all macrophage. And you can see it's kind of gobbling up some pathogen. So it's actually physically wrapping a membrane around that pathogen, so that it can bring it inside of the cell, bring it inside of itself. A macrophage is just a kind of immune cell, and we'll talk more about that. And it's going to destroy it. So it's going to make it inert, so that it will not be able to infect us anymore. I just thought that was a cool picture. So, really? Seriously? Okay. That's nice. Why does it just do that sometimes? And then it won't. Yeah. Okay. Great. So now it won't actually erase it. Why? Okay. That's gonna make. I hate it when it does this. In that case, let me just start a new slideshow, and hopefully this doesn't happen every time I do this, because it gets in this glitchy thing where it will do that every time. Every time I write, it refuses to erase for some reason. I don't want to do this every time because it takes too long. We really won't get many notes done. Wow. We're on like 3, 4. Okay, so there are different kinds of immunities. There's some that you're born with, and those are innate immunities. And so they're there right upon birth. And then there are also what we call adaptive immunity. And we're going to go through both adaptive and innate immunity in this unit. So innate immunity is going to be recognition of, this is usually a very quick response, and it's usually things that are kind of generalized features that all pathogens have. So all pathogens have a particular set of receptors on their surface, on their cell membranes, and that will be something that an innate response can recognize. In innate immunity, you have things like the skin, You have mucous membranes. You also have phagocytotic skills. We'll go through all these. Phagocytotic, we talked about macrophages. That's an example. Phagocytotic is an example of a macrophage. Or macrophage is an example of phagocytotic. We're going to go through all this. So don't worry if you're like, oh my God, she's going so fast and I'm not writing this all down. It's okay. We're going to go through all of this. And then the adaptive one is going to be, we only find that in vertebrates. So animals with backbones, organisms with backbones. And these are ability of our immune system to recognize a new specific infection pathogen that's different that we've never seen before. And we can adapt to that infection and form a response that will be tailored towards just that particular infection. Innate immunity is found in all animals and in plants. Plants have immunity too. They have all sorts of ways that they can fight off infections. Is kind of cool. That was another thing that they took out of the curriculum, which is kind of a bummer. Invertebrates, you only have invertebrates, you have innate, and you also have adaptive. You don't see that in other animals and plants as well. Innate immunity includes barrier defenses. That's like the skin, mucous membranes, as well as phagocytosis and the inflammatory response. And we're going to talk about each one of those. I really love immunity because so much of it applies to, obviously, us and our everyday lives. Because, you get sick, these things are all happening, right? And so I think it's kind of cool to, when you're sick and think, okay, well, my body is doing this right now. My body is not doing that right now. I think that's kind of cool. Let's start off with the very basics, which are the barriers. So there are barriers that allow us to stay healthy. And those include like the mucous membranes. So the lining of our nostrils, of our digestive tract, of our urinary tract. Those all have ways to get rid of infections. So there's mucus. That mucus traps the bacteria, and then you cough it out, you sneeze it out, you remove it that way. Your eyes you have bodily fluids, like your eyes will, when they tear up, they're going to get rid of dust and dirt and any bacterial or viral thing that could be poking around in there as well. There's also both the digestive system, because the digestive system goes right from the environment into your body. It's a big opening. It has a very low pH. So our stomach has a very low pH. Our skin also has a very low pH. So that's, and when I say low, it's around 2. It's around 2. So that helps for a lot of bacteria. A lot of bacteria can't survive in that environment. So if they go down that digestive tract, they're out of luck. They can maybe go through the respiratory tract and get a hold that way, but they can't go through the digestive or the stomach. Innate immune cells in mammals detect, devour, I like that, and destroy invading pathogens. And those are given the term when that happens, when a large chunk of something is taken into a cell that's solid, that's called phagocytosis. We talked about endocytosis earlier, and we talked about phagocytosis and pinocytosis. What was pino? I remember? Drinking. Yeah, we're drinking. So phago is just large solid particles that are brought in. And so there are phagocytotic cells, and that's their jobs. One type of phagocytotic cell is the white blood cell. So white blood cells, if you've ever gone to the doctor and they say your white blood cell count is elevated, that is telling them that there's an infection going on. Your white blood cells are produced in response to an infection. And that can be a good indication of something going on, and they can go from there to try and figure out what it is. Phagocytotic cells usually recognize a group of pathogens that have these things called TLRs, or toll-like receptors. So they're a group of receptors that don't usually vary too much from one kind of pathogen to the next. They're pretty standard recognition molecules that you find on them. And because of that, these phagocytotic cells recognize them, and you're born with that immunity. And so they already in the DNA, it's like, oh yeah, I recognize that particular receptor. That does not belong here. So that's how it's recognizing something as foreign. TLRs recognize fragments of molecules on a pathogen. That could be a flagellum, for example. It could be the little tail that the bacterium has. Maybe that's going to be what it recognizes. But there's some, oh yeah, that doesn't look like it belongs here. Okay, so here's an example of this whole process of a phagocytotic cell. And it's starting up there at the top, and it has its little membrane that we call it a pseudopodia. It's kind of like a little foot. It's a false pseudopodia, literally means false foot. So what it's doing is it's kind of reaching out, and it's surrounding the particles. And as it surrounds the particles, it makes a little bubble, it makes a little vesicle around it. And once that vesicle is inside, what was the organelle that was responsible for digesting things? Lysosomes. Yeah. So the lysosomes here have digestive enzymes in them. And what they will do is they will fuse with that vacuole. So here we're going to fuse with that vacuole and they'll dump their digestive enzymes into the vesicle containing the product that you brought inside, that viral particle or bacterial particle or what have you. And then they break it up. And after they break it up, they release it. And that release of that pathogen is going to, now it's inert. It's not going to hurt anybody, but that's going to be some of the reason that you are, you're sneezing, you're coughing, and things are coming out of your nose, right? Things are coming out of your cough. And some of that is those digested particles. Those are coming out, and you're getting rid of those as you expel them through coughing or sneezing or blowing your nose. Yeah, not going to erase again. That's awesome. That's what I was afraid of. There are two main types of phagocytotic cells that will engulf and destroy pathogens: neutrophil cells and macrophages. So macrophage, that's the word that was in that picture that I showed you with that big white thing that was engulfing that green pathogen. These guys live in both your bloodstream as well as something called the lymphatic system. I don't know if the notes in here are going to talk about lymphatic system. They should. Oh, perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. So anyone know anything about the lymphatic system? Yeah, your lymph nodes, right? Lymph nodes are part of it. So you go to the doctor, what do? They feel here, right? They're feeling to see if you have swollen lymph nodes, because those are one of the primary spots that you're going to find white blood cells. So those white blood cells are going to be, those macrophages are going to be doing their job. And if they're doing their job for certain types of infections, these will be swollen. And that is a sign that you are infected, but it's also a sign that your immune system is working. Okay. So lymphatic system is a series of tubes, vessels, that run parallel to your circulatory system. Okay, so they run right next to all your blood vessels, all your veins, your arteries, your capillaries. There are these little lymphatic vessels right next to them. And so when something infects the bloodstream, for example, it can, the macrophages and different infected cells can push that material into the lymphatic tissue. And then from there, that lymphatic tissue, some of that will be coughed up and spewed out, and some of it will be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream at certain points. Okay, but it's a really important part of your body. I have a funny story where, no, it was funny. It was annoying, actually. Anyone get massages? Maybe too young for that. I feel like young people are like a little not wanting to have massages, but man, they're amazing. Anyway, so yeah. So what do they tell you to do after massage? Nothing? Anything? Chill? Yeah. Well, you feel like chilling, right? Because you want to fall asleep because it feels so good. But one of the things they do is they tell you to drink a lot of water, because what they're doing when they do that massages is they are pushing. So the lymphatic, so your blood vessels, your circulatory system, it has a pump. What's our pump? Your heart. The lymphatic system doesn't have that. So the lymphatic system relies on you moving around and using your muscles. So as you use your muscles, you squeeze the lymphatic tissue, and that squeezes the fluid that's in it around the body. When you get a massage, you're getting one giant squeeze. And so that can it can dehydrate you, because a lot of that then gets flushed out, and you urinate it out, and you need to drink more water. Now, what can also happen is if you have an infection kind of brewing in your body and you don't really know it, and you get that massage, it will actually push some of that into the circulatory system. And I found that out the hard way, because I was fighting off an infection, and 6 hours after I had my massage, I got sick. This was a long time ago, but that can happen. So don't recommend it if you are actively sick or if you're recovering from an illness, because that can make it longer, because you're pushing that stuff back into the circulatory system. Okay, so so we talked about barriers, we talked about macrophage cells, and how they gobble up things. So let's not talk about what's called the inflammatory response. So inflammatory response is, you've all had it, a situation where you look at your finger and you're like, oh, let's say you get a sliver in your finger, and you pull it out, but afterwards, what might it look like if you get an infection? Red. You could have fluid coming out of it, right? Warm. Okay. All of those are part of the inflammatory response. All those things are brought on when there's an infection. There are parts of the immune system that are called mast cells. And mast cells' job is to, when they know that there's something foreign in the body, their job is to release a chemical called histamine. And histamine will trigger a local response that makes the blood vessels around that infection get bigger, dilate. And it also makes them more permeable. What does permeable mean?
Things can go through it.
Things can go through it, yeah. So it means that the blood vessels around that infection, things can go through there more easily. And what that does is it triggers all of the immune cells start to come into that area, because now you're dilating it. So all the immune system cells are going to come to that area, because that's where the most flow of blood is going to be. So it's going to get red, because you've got all of these things coming to the area. The release of histamine also attracts those macrophage cells, so those phagocytotic cells, which will gobble up any infection that happens to be around. And it's gross, but it's actually helpful. Sometimes if it gets really infected, it gets red and it gets swollen. And then I don't know about you, but if I get one on sometimes I get them like around my fingernails. Anyone ever had that happen? Maybe it's just me. And then I stick my hand in warm water, and afterwards I take it out and I push really hard. I squeeze really hard. What comes out? Pus. Ew, such a gross word. Pus is all of those white blood cells, those macrophage cells, as well as dead pathogen and other debris from the damaged tissue. So that's all stuff that needs to come out, but it's all stuff that indicates that your immune system is working, it's starting to heal, but it is actively fighting off that infection. So here's a picture of that. I've got my little pathogen, my little splinter, or the green stuff around it. in that picture. I'm going to make it bigger because it's pretty small, and we're still going to see a circle. Sorry about that. Ay, ay, ay. Wow. I need to reboot my computer. Okay, so I've got all those little pathogens in green there around there. And then I've got a couple of things happening. I've got, there's always macrophage cells that are kind of floating around. The mast cells will start the whole process. They'll send out that histamine molecule that will cause the red blood cell, the capillary there to get wider. That gives more holes, more pores, makes it more permeable, so that now I can get in my macrophage cells. So in that next picture, I have some more macrophages that are gobbling up. They're coming out of the bloodstream now because you can see that my red blood, I don't want to say red blood cell, my capillary is wider here. And now the macrophages are able to move through those little pores, and they can get through there and they can gobble up that infection. Yeah. And then, so we're pretty much done at that point. Inflammation can be localized. It can also be systemic, meaning that it takes, if you don't treat an infection on your finger, it will go systemic. Okay, and that is really not a good thing. Sometimes I actually had a tooth that one dentist would not believe me. He would not believe that I had an infection because of my tooth, because I had an infected tooth. And I went to a different dentist who was the mom of one of my students, actually. And she took the tooth out. And as soon as she took the tooth out, the fever went away. Like, yeah. I actually shouldn't take it out. I'm sorry. She did, what's that called? Root canal. Yeah, my one and only. Hopefully never again. But anyway, a fever is a systemic reaction to substances that are released by macrophages. Yeah.
Wait, so your tooth was causing you to be sick?
Yeah.
How did you know? Well, she just...
Biology. Yeah, I mean, I figured it out. Yeah. And he was like, no, that's not doing it. I'm like, yeah, I think it is. I think I now have a systemic reaction. Yeah. So when you get a fever, when you are sick and you get a fever, that is your body's way of fighting off the infection. And I think we talked about this before, didn't we? Okay, so fevers raise your body temperature slightly. And in doing so, they affect the proteins of the pathogen. What do they do to the proteins? Change their shape. They denature them. Good. So as a result, those bacteria, a lot of times they can't reproduce because their proteins have broken down and they're not able to do that. And that fights off the infection. So that is why, if you can stand it, it's better to let a fever run its course. Now, if a fever gets really high, you definitely want to take something to see if you can bring it down. And if you can't bring it down, then you should go to the ER, because a fever of 103, 104 starts to denature our proteins, specifically our brain proteins. And that is permanent. So we don't want to let the fever run too high.
Wait, it's permanent in the brain?
Yes.
It can't be. I thought it
Brain's not good at regenerating itself.
I thought like the properties of the proteins were that they just like went back to like...
Once a protein's denatured, it usually doesn't go back into shape. Yeah. Yeah. Sepsis. Has anyone heard of sepsis? Sepsis is where you have a systemic infection that is rampant through the body. So it's all over the body. It's everywhere, and it can be life-threatening. Usually they will put you in the hospital when that happens. They'll put you on a IV drip of an antibiotic, probably several. Usually it's a cocktail. It's not something that you want to ever have to go through. Not a good thing. Some pathogens avoid destruction by the whole reason that this innate immunity can recognize these pathogens is because of the shape of these receptors. So there's these surface proteins on the receptors that have a certain shape. And because they have a certain shape, they are recognized by our immune system. But if the pathogens can change their surface protein shape, then macrophages won't detect them. And that is not a conscious decision by the bacteria to say, I'm going to change my shape. It's really a matter of, we haven't really talked about this yet, but it's a matter of when the bacteria reproduce. And this happens especially with viruses, actually, as well, because they don't have very good DNA checkers. But what happens is there's a mutation in their DNA. As they copy themselves repeatedly, there's a chance for mistakes to be made in the copying of the DNA. And sometimes the mistakes are made in a way that is actually beneficial. And if they change the shape of that surface protein, then that would be a beneficial change that our immune system isn't going to recognize. Streptococcus pneumoniae. Let's just call it pneumonia. Is an example that it's actually a bacterium, so it's a bacterial infection, as well as meningitis. Meningitis is an inflammation of the lining, the layers of the brain. And obviously, brain infection is one of the worst ones that you can have. TB, tuberculosis, is another one that is a respiratory illness, also bacterial. And these are all pathogens that have been able to change their shape so that our innate immune system doesn't recognize it. Okay, and then that makes it hard to deal with. Okay, I want to stop there because this is going to take a while, and everyone wants to finish early, so we'll do that.